Hi, I'm David Kolb. About 2016, I published an essay called A Shaky Walk Downhill, which describes my life as a professional philosopher facing Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's is a degenerative disease going downhill, and I tried to write about how philosophy helped and didn't help my ways of dealing with this disease. More recently, in 2021, I gave two talks at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Oregon, where I extended some ideas from that essay, linking it to things from Stoic and Epicurean philosophy. This present video is a summary of those talks. Looking back, if you've read that essay, I'm going to take certain themes from the essay, but not the whole thing. I have two pictures here of computers, me working on a computer, typing away, and in a computer lab. I was very good at typing for reasons, autobiographical reasons, that start from the fact that my mother was a high school typing teacher. So I got pretty good, and I was a secretary, worked as a secretary for a while. So I was very good at writing and that. And then it began to go bad. Then I began to make a lot of typing mistakes. After a lot of hoo-ha about it, it turned out I had Parkinson's disease. That's a picture of James Parkinson, 1817. He called it the shaking palsy, but it's come to be known as Parkinson's disease. It's a brain disorder. It leads to shaking, stiffness, and difficulty with balance, walking, and so on. And it gradually gets worse over time. Sometimes you get very, very bad. This is a typical picture of a Parkinson sufferer, bent over a bit because your sense of balance gets screwed up, shaking, especially in your hands. Your face tends to get very unexpressive, and you get rigid in your muscles and stiff. There's various things that are happening. No one knows the cause of it. But there's certainly genetic factors. There are just age, although people can get it young. And there's environmental factors. Certain chemicals in the environment certainly make it worse. And there are various things that happen in the brain which involve misfolded proteins and cells which get messed up. For a long time, it was thought that the cells that get messed up are just the ones that deal with dopamine, which control your motor activity. But it turns out other neurotransmitters are also being fouled up. And you can see in that complicated-looking diagram there that there are issues with several different, there's some problems with the mitochondria, there's problems with garbage disposal in the cells, and so on. The upshot of it is that a lot of cells die. By the time you get diagnosed, probably 2/3 of the cells involved in dopamine have died. And the medications do not solve anything. There's no medications. They don't know exactly what causes the disease. So what you end up with is symptomatic relief. There are 5 stages to the disease typically given. They're written on the bottom. Basically, it gets worse. Now I want to talk about my own experience. Now this is tricky because what I want to say is what it feels like to have Parkinson's. But this is not a pity party. I'm not looking for people to say, oh, gee, tough luck and all that. I want to describe some symptoms because then I want to talk about how you try to integrate those symptoms in your life, and that's where the philosophy comes in. So a few words about the symptoms. This is the classic list of basic Parkinson's symptoms. Tremor, hands shaking. What that means is that after a while your hands are not very good for fine motor coordination. I can't type. I can't even use a mouse on a computer very well because it jiggles all around. I have trouble holding soup in my hand. I don't dare pour bottles and things like that. So tremor affects daily life in a lot of ways. Bradykinesia, brady is the Greek word for slowness, slow movement. You find yourself moving more slowly and not being aware that you are. Your rocking gets messed up. Your muscles get rigid, especially in your hands, your legs at morning, and so on. And your posture gets bad without you realizing it. You stoop over, you walk funny because you think you have to, because something in the brain is messed up. So the problem with a lot of the Parkinson symptoms is you're not aware of them until they happen. And then you say, oh my God, it's been happening for 6 months and I didn't notice. The one that really gets you after a while is this loss of automatic movements. Things that come automatically, like blinking, swinging your arms when you walk, they stop or they slow down tremendously. Swallowing so you don't have saliva dripping out of your mouth. Drooling is a symptom. It's very unpleasant. It's not because you have too much saliva, it's because you forget to swallow. And your eyes get dry because you don't blink enough. And there's problems with your talking and your writing and so on. Then there's a whole host of other lovely symptoms they call non-motor symptoms: depression, anxiety, cognitive changes, mild cognitive, more serious cognitive changes, hallucinations. I haven't had those. Various sleep disorders, constipation, vision problems, loss of the sense of smell. There's a lot of talk right now about COVID causing people to lose their sense of smell and how terrible that is. I lost my sense of smell 15 years ago. I didn't realize it for a long time. And sexual problems, impulse control disorders, and so on. There's a lot. And what treatments we have only help the motor symptoms, not any of this other stuff. So there's a lot going on. And let's think about it. What Parkinson's means is you go downhill. The thing you can be sure of is that 6 months from now, there'll be something you do now that you won't be able to do later. And something you can't do now, you remember being able to do 6 months ago. So it's loss, constant. Things are nibbling away at you all the time. Things you can't do, things you won't be able to do. Do it now because you won't be able to. So you're presented every day with aging and death and loss. So what I want to talk about is that sense of loss, the feeling that I used to be able to do things and I can't. I used to be able to type fast. Now I can't type. I used to be a dancer. I can't dance very well anymore. I used to be very light on my feet. Now I'm clumping about. So there's all sorts of things which you feel your life is being constricted as the disease progresses. It's an odd word, progression. Disease has its own progress, but it's actually a regress. It's going downhill. So what do you do if your life is a sequence of losses? Everybody does this in aging. I mean, we have a dream about aging. Here's what we want. We want to go along pretty well, and then, boom, die. Overnight, we're dead. People get killed by a stroke while they're asleep, and people say, oh, he was lucky. He didn't have a long degenerative time. But very few people actually have that experience. Mostly you sort of go downhill slowly. And in Parkinson's, that happens earlier, and it's constant, and you know it's going to go on. How do you deal with that? It's a chronic disease. Chronic comes from the word chronos, for time. Chronos, the god, is Saturn, who devours his children. Chronic disease messes up your experience of time. So how do you integrate that into your life? What I'm suggesting is you have to find some way to narrate, to tell a story about that loss to yourself, just to make sense of it. And this is where the philosophy comes in. We're going to start with religion first. So that's the theme for this part of this talk, narrating or making a story out of your loss, your symptoms. There are received narratives floating about. I'm going to talk about two that were predominant in my childhood, and then speak about the law of karma. I was brought up very intensely as a Catholic. And one of the slogans that we were told was, God will never give you a cross to bear too strong for you to carry. In other words, you're in good shape because you'll suffer a lot, but God will give you the strength to deal with that suffering. It's not always clear why he wants to make you suffer. My experience as a kid was that God was a judging God. Come on, do it right or I'm going to get you. So this experience, that God is going to give you the power to deal with what he's also giving you, which is in this case the suffering. It's not very encouraging, because you sort of wait, why is this powerful God doing this to me? On the other hand, there's a positive way to look at it. There's a joke. It's a Jewish joke, but I'll Christianize it because I can't tell a good Jewish joke with a good accent. So this priest is in a flood. The town is flooded. He's on the roof of his house waiting to be rescued, saying, God, rescue me. And a guy comes out in a boat and says, hey, Padre, you want to get in the boat? Says, no, God will take care of me. The boat goes off. A little later, a helicopter comes down. The guy says, hey, Padre, get in the helicopter. No, God will take care of me. So the flood comes and he dies. He goes up to heaven and he stares at St. Peter and God and says, what is this? I prayed you, you didn't help me. And God says, look, I sent you a boat and I sent you a helicopter. What do you want? Right? The point is, the strength that you have may be other people. And that's part of what Parkinson's forces you to realize, is that you can't do it alone. There are support groups. There are support caregivers. My wife is terribly important. All of us in the Parkinson's community rely on other people and one another. So that really forces you into a kind of non-single-handed survival. Now there's another religious story that I learned later, which is a little more extreme, which says, if you are proud of something, God will take it away from you because he wants you to rely only on him. And I always thought, this is really nasty. And as Parkinson's took away all sorts of things that I was proud of, ability to speak, ability to dance, ability to write smoothly and so on, ability to stand straight, ability not to have my hands shaking all the time, I felt persecuted. So that seemed to me really an evil. And then I began reflecting. That notion that God takes away from you in order to rely on him comes actually from certain late medieval thinkers. And what they were saying, if you look at it, is relying on God means to find God's will in your life without relying on your normal roles and customs and identities. It's a way of saying you have to have flexibility and open yourself to new possibilities, which in the essay I talk of in Heideggerian terms. In any case, those Christianized things are basically saying, yes, you're suffering, kiddo. It's God's will. You don't have to just suck it up. He'll help you. We don't know how, but you can do it. Rely on your friends and so on. Now, the point of that religious Christianized thing is there is an intention. This is not just a weird event. It's been planned. God has got this. It's for you. You don't know why it's good for you, but it will be good for you. May not be good now. So it's an intention. That's going to be important because we're going to look at that in comparison with the Stoics in a minute. Now, another thing that's been floating about lately is the law of karma, broadly speaking, borrowed from Eastern philosophy. The word karma in Sanskrit literally means action. The kur verb means to do. And the interesting thing about the law of karma is that it is not an intention. It's simply the mechanical result of previous actions. In fact, if you go way back in early Indian philosophy, the law of karma comes from a rather materialist conception that your soul is picking up impurities when its actions are bad actions. It's like sooty stuff coming into a transparent soul. So karma has nothing to do with being judged. We tend to think about, in the Christian terms, or even in early Greek terms, there's the judge when you die. St. Peter with his book. The law of karma is mechanical. It has nothing to do with anyone judging you. It's just, you did this happened. So those are narratives. And I'm expressing, obviously, a certain dissatisfaction with these. So what we need to do is look at some philosophical narratives. Now, this is where I come in writing that essay. And here I am. I'm 60 years old. I'm a philosopher. I've written a lot. I've taught a lot. And now I've got Parkinson's disease. Now, what the hell do I do with it? So I look around to the philosophers that I know and put a list up there. By the way, that site, What It Is Like to Be a Philosopher, is a good site. They interview contemporary philosophers, women and men, and you learn a lot about what it really is to live either an academic or non-academic life as a philosopher. So I looked around. I've spent a lot of my life teaching medieval, Greek, 19th century, and many 20th century philosophers. And frankly, I didn't find much to help. Chronic disease like Parkinson. It's a rather specialized problem, which really has to do with aging, and no philosopher seems to have much to say about that. So I turned to the Stoics. The reason I turned to the Stoics has to do with some poetry that I was reading, and that I'll deal with separately after we take this part. The Stoics, if you think about it, they're Greeks and Romans, before you get to Stoics and things like that, have a sort of idea that there are spirits, there are multiple gods, you better be careful. You devote yourself to this God won't like you. You devote yourself to the God of love, the God of chastity won't like you. You devote yourself to war, the God of peace won't like you. So you're in a world where values clash, and you have to be constantly pacifying these different spirits in God. It's tragic. There's no solution to it all. The Stoics are much against that. The Stoics say, no, there is an overall rationality to the world. Values and virtues are harmonious. They come together. This comes out of Socrates and Plato. But the Stoics say there is a reason, a logos, if you want the word, Greek word, in the world, which means that everything has a purpose. You have to find the purpose, and you have to fill yourself with the virtues that you need in order to live a good life. Illness is a difficulty, because is that my role in life? Here's a quote. This is from Marcus Aurelius. From Apollonius, one of his teachers, I learned freedom of the will and undeviating steadiness of purpose, and to look to nothing else, not even for a moment, except to reason, and to be always the same, in sharp pain, on the occasion of the loss of a child, and in long illness. Now, we'll be dealing with Marcus, and I'll say a few words about them in a moment, but let's go on a second. This is another famous quote from Epictetus. You've heard it. Some things are in our control, and others are not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion. In other words, our own actions, our reactions, you might say, to things. Things not in our control, our body, property, reputation, command, whatever are not our own actions. Remember that. If you suppose that what belongs to others is your own, you'll be hindered, you'll lament, you'll be disturbed, and you'll find fault with the gods and men. That's the very beginning of a little handbook, the Enchiridion, which in Latin is manuale, manual, handbook, which is from Epictetus. Well, here's another quote. This is Marcus Aurelius again. Remember, we're taking the idea that things are planned, that the world is a unity. It's not squabbling Greek gods, but it's overall a kind of harmonious whole, which sounds very much like the Christian notion of providence, in part because the Christian notion of providence took some stuff from Stoicism. You came into the world as a part. You will vanish into that which gave you birth. Or rather, you will be taken up into its generative reason, the underlying irrational process, by the process of change. Another quote. All things are woven together, and the common bond is sacred. And scarcely one thing is foreign to another, for they have been arranged together in their places, and together make the same ordered cosmos. I remind you that cosmos means an orderly assembly of things. One substance, one law, one common reason of all intelligent creatures, and one truth. If indeed the perfection of creatures is of the same family and partaking of the same reason, is one. How does that help me deal with Parkinson's disease? Come on. This is another Epictetus quote. Remember that you are an actor in a drama, of such a kind as the author pleases to make it. If short, a short one. If long, a long one. If it's his pleasure, you should act as a poor man, a cripple, someone with Parkinson, a governor, or private person. See that you act it naturally, for this is your business. To act well the character assigned to you. To choose it is another's business, not yours. Now that sounds good. We're all actors in a play. Shakespeare says that. We don't choose our role. Now play your role well. It's a very conservative doctrine. And it's sort of, oh yeah, we know, self-help, right? But I want to make a point here. And to do that, unfortunately, I have to look at the Greek. There's the same quote. And below it is the Greek from Epictetus. And I want to point out two words in it that are important, but actually I'll point out three. You are an actor. The Greek word underlined, hypokrites, means we take our word hypocrite from that. You're an actor in a drama. Of such a kind as the author, the Greek word is didaskalos, really means the producer. If a short one, a long one. For this is your business. Now that's interesting. In the Greek there's no business. It just says, this is yours, sonia. And here's the point. To act well the character assigned to you. The Greek word is prosopon. And a prosopon is a mask. If you think about, you've seen the Roman and Greek theaters. They're sort of like big amphitheaters. People are pretty far from the stage. You're not going to get the kind of fine acting that you get with a close-up on a screen. The actor's going to be way over there. Actors tended to wear masks. The mask was designed to give the feeling of the character. Funny, hard, old, new. And often they had built in, because it was a wooden mask, a sort of megaphone effect to increase your voice. Now what interests me is the idea of a mask, because the word prosopon, a word for mask, means before your eyes. It means there's somebody inside the mask. Right? Who is that? We'll come back to that later. So, go back to this. This idea of acting a role is a little more complicated than it looks like, because in the very word for the mask, there's an implication that they're not completely taken up by your role. There's something behind the mask. Now, a word about these people that we're talking about. Epictetus was born in 50 AD, in Turkey actually, died in Greece, but he spent a lot of time in Rome. He was a slave when he was a kid, and he studied philosophy. He got free and began to teach, and Emperor Hadrian liked him, and he died and he lived a very simple life. This is from the Wikipedia article on Epictetus. He didn't write anything. All the stuff that's writings of Epictetus are from a disciple. And these are some of the things he talks about, different kinds of passions that we have. And Marcus Aurelius, who was born in 121 and died in 180, now think about that. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor, but he was a century after the foundation of the empire. And he spent most of his time actually in Germany. There were a lot of fighting going on. He had to lead armies up. He died actually near Vienna. There was a big plague. His very complicated business running the empire. What we have, the book, the Meditations, is simply a diary of his. It wasn't meant to be published. It was a private diary, but people got a hold of it. And if you read the thing, it's repetitious. It's little slogans and paragraphs he wrote every day while he was running a military campaign, while he was trying to keep the empire together. So here's a comment from him. He never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but we care more about their opinions than our own. As we're too influenced by what other people think about. And then he says, a king's part is to do good and to be reviled. That is, I have to do good. People are not going to treat me well about it, but I still have to be good. So let's think about the Stoics now. The Stoic picture is that the world is a unified place, an orderly place. There's an underlying rationality. The world is a cosmos, an animal, as it says, which means it functions in an orderly way. And I have a role to play in that. Probably I don't know what that role is. If I'm the Roman emperor, it's pretty obvious. Marcus knew what his business was, is to do good and to be reviled. But me, with Parkinson's disease, I have to accept. It's a bit like the Christian thing, except that the reason, the rational plan, does not necessarily have a planner behind it. It's an overall unified thing. And I have a role to play. I must accept that role and play it well. I have a duty. I have to act virtuously. But what that means in the concrete is to find decisions to be made day to day, which will be just and prudent, right? And which will allow me to serve that role, which is going to have to be felt out. Because obviously, having Parkinson's disease is not a role which is one of the standard lists. You know, wife, husband, emperor, merchant, soldier, chronic disease member. You know, do we regard this as sort of an interference with a role or a role on its own? It's not completely clear how we should regard that. Given our own view of things, that disease is a temporary thing. Disease is a deviation to be cured. We don't think of that as having a role. The problem is a chronic disease, especially an incurable one like Parkinson's, is a role. And we don't have any rules for it. We don't know what it means to play that role. If we were in a society where, say, being crippled and begging on the street, say in India, where that's a standard profession, then I'd know how to be a good crippled beggar. But how do you become a good Parkinson's person? It's not clear. So you have to invent it, or what do? I'm saying that this is not very satisfying to say your role. I mean, you're not the emperor, you're not a soldier. You've got this illness which has twisted your life. Is it now your role to be that? Or do you be what you are, an ex-philosophy teacher, a member of a committee, and so on, with this disease nagging at the side of you, right? There's not really any very clear rules for that. Well, maybe the Stoic thing isn't enough. Let's look at the Epicureans. Now here we have a problem. As I told you last week when we were looking at the physics, the picture of the Stoic universe is a whole, rationally composed. Everything works together. The Epicurean works just the opposite way. It's atoms bouncing around in space. It has no overall plan. And so the only thing that the Epicureans could say about my illness is, hey, it's a random chance, pure events, tough luck, kid, but, deal with it as you can, try to find pleasure. Now, when I said before that we're trying to find a narrative that will take the loss that Parkinson's brings and make it into something you can hold and say, this makes sense in my life. Well, the Epicurean response is, it doesn't make sense. It's like a meteorite that comes down and hits your house. There's no purpose to it. God didn't send it. It just happened. This thing in the brain, whatever it is, how caused it, whatever. Just live with it, buddy. That's not exactly a narrative. It isn't a story that gives you hope, but it does say, don't be scared. This happens to us all, one thing or another. Right? So that's a very different mode. It's not saying God is testing you, like the first Christian thing. It's not saying God is leading you to something new. It's not saying it's a role in a play that's been put up. It's just saying it's a happening. Happenings have no plan. But you have to respond to it, the Epicureans would say, by finding a way to have a moderately pleasurable life, which gets more difficult. Yeah, so it gets difficult. Live with it. I might note, by the way, in passing, that the Epicurean atomism sounds a lot like our own theories about atoms, but it's very different in one respect. We think, things are explained by atoms, let's try to figure out which atoms are involved, find a new molecule, take this pill, and it will help. Whereas Epicurean atoms were so small and so imperceptible that there was no way to investigate them. So they didn't have this idea that we should intervene. Our notion is very much a matter of intervention. But that's something new. I mean, medicine in the old days was a matter of intervention, but a chronic disease has no intervention. You just have to minimize it. So the Epicureans want me to find ataraxia. Remember, ataraxia means unshaken. You're not shaken. Taraxa means to shake something. The negative. Ataraxia. You're not thrown off your balance by this disease, which, as a matter of fact, messes up your balance. So find pleasure. Now, if you look at the writings of people who suffer from Parkinson's disease, you will find there's a lot of this. Saying, well, I can't do this, I can't do that anymore, but I really appreciate X, Y, and Z, maybe even more than I did before, because it's all I can appreciate. So the garden idea, finding the garden, reducing your expectations, makes a lot of sense when the disease is busy reducing your abilities all the time. The funny thing is, when I started looking into it, I found out that the Stoics and Epicureans, though their narrative about the illness is very different. The Stoics is it's part of a plan, find your role, fit in. The Epicureans is no plan, it's just a random event. They're very different in their story, but they're not very different in what they recommend for dealing with illness. Find yourself ataraxia, find ways not to be shaken by it. So let's look at some of the quotes. This is Epictetus again on the left, and Epicurus on the right. Epictetus is a Stoic. Sickness is a hindrance to the body, but not your ability to choose, unless that is your choice. Sickness will make you miserable, but that misery, if you choose to respond to it one way or another, that's what's important. Lameness is a hindrance to the leg, but not your ability to choose. Say this to yourself with regard to everything that happens. You'll see such obstacles as hindrances to something else, but not to yourself. So You might say this sounds like this, oh, suck it up, baby. But really what it is there's pain, there's loss. You have a choice how you react to it. React in a way which leaves you unshaken. Which means, of course, you have to give up a lot of things. But all right, you give it up. Now that's not very different from what Epicurus said. These are the roots of all evil. Fear of the gods, of death, of pain, and a desire which goes beyond what nature requires for a happy life. Jeffrey was talking about that. And this is the height of pleasure, to be free from pain and discomfort in body and mind. Illness, which causes excruciating pain, lasts only a short time, and then you're free. You're dead. Or the illness goes away. Illnesses which cause mild pain may last long, but it's possible to live in such a way that the pleasures of life far outweigh the discomfort. Either way, the pain is nothing to fear. That's focused too much on pain, to my mind, because it's not the pain caused by Parkinson's, it's the loss, it's the constriction of life. But you can see that neither of these, either the Epictetus nor the Epicurus, face up really to a chronic degenerative disease. They're still thinking of disease as either a short, sharp shock that kills you or something that goes away. But if it doesn't go away, how do you deal with that? Here's another quote. Pain is slight if opinion has added nothing to it. In thinking it slight, you will make it slight. Everything depends on opinion. Opinion is your reaction to the pain. You can't control the fact that you have the pain. You can't control your reaction to it. Ambition, luxury, greed hark back to opinion. It's according to opinion that we suffer. Virtue and steadfastness of soul is what we want. That, by the way, is Seneca. Lucius Annaeus Seneca the Younger, another famous Stoic writer, tutor to the Emperor Nero. Hey, Nero. Right? Nero was actually a pretty good Roman emperor, but he had his quirks and he caused a lot of trouble toward the end. Well, Seneca was older and he was a tutor and he helped him. But eventually, when Nero went a little bit nuts, he told Seneca to kill himself, which he did. And his stoic and calm suicide has become a subject of numerous paintings. Seneca wrote a lot. He's not someone the typical philosophers read these days. Seneca and Cicero are good sources for Stoicism and Epicureanism. And professional philosophers these days tend not to read them, but they're very useful. Epicurus, we're going back. Now this is a very interesting quote. Notice the quote is from Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic. But he's praising Epicurus. It means their perception of what you have to think about for illness are coming together. Epicurus says, "In my sickness, my conversation was not about my bodily suffering. Nor, says he, did I talk on such subjects to those who visited me, but I continued to discourse on the nature of things as before." Keeping to this main point, how the mind, while participating in such movements as go on in the poor flesh, shall be free from perturbation and retain its proper good. So, that's something that Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus would say, and he's saying Epicurus said it too. Nor did I, he says, give the physicians an opportunity of putting on solemn looks, as if they were doing something great. My life went on well and happily. Do the same. This is Marcus talking. Same thing that he, Epicurus, did, both in sickness, if you're sick, and in other circumstances. Look for virtue, keep your mind controlled. So, that advice is good advice. But it seems to me it's rather inadequate advice, and I'm going to argue that in a minute. And this is a very interesting quote. Now, if you look at the bottom of the screen, this is from Diogenes Laertius, Lives of the Philosophers. Who is Diogenes Laertius? He's, like Plutarch, wrote a lot of biographies of famous people, centuries after them. So we have no idea whether the details of the biographies are accurate. What we do have, however, in many of these biographies is quotations from books written by these philosophers, which no longer exist. So we know that these were not just made up out of whole cloth, and they provide sources where you can find quotations from the books that have vanished. In any case, this is Diogenes Laertius talking about the death of Epicurus. It seems from what Epicurus says that he died from prostate cancer or something like it. And he wrote, "On this blissful day, which is the last of my life, I write this to you. My continual sufferings from strangury, blockage of the bladder, and dysentery are so great nothing could augment them. I'm really in pain. But the cheerfulness of my mind, which arises from the remembrance of our past conversations, counterbalances these afflictions." So the garden overcomes the pain. "I'm asking you to care for the children of Metrodorus in a manner befitting the devotion you have given to me at Philosophy Sensu Reluth." Interestingly, Epicurus was famous for the fact that people asked him to care for their children. He was considered to be a man of great care and concern. So it's not as completely selfish as you might think. I'm just happy in my garden. Right? He had kids to take care of. People trusted him to, if they died, to deal with their family. Hermippus relates that he entered a bronze bath tempered with warm water, asked for a cup of undiluted wine and drank it, bade his friends to remain his doctrines, and expired. So if you think about these quotes I've given you about illness, you see that basically, though those pictures are quite different, one is everything is in order and rational, the other is nothing is in order and rational, what they're recommending for your life is pretty much the same. Don't let the pain conquer you. Find a way to keep a peaceful, strong mind, and look for possibilities that are restricted in your life. And I'm going to be arguing in that essay that we have to do that, but there are certain things that have to be added. There's another quote from Marcus Aurelius. "Live a good life. If there are gods, and they are just, then they will not care how devout you have been, but will welcome you based on the virtues you have lived by." So, this is a sort of gamble. You live well, follow the virtues, and if the gods are just, they'll benefit. If there are gods, but they're unjust, you should not want to worship them. If we're in a world with nasty gods, well, we have to be on our own. If there are no gods, then you will be gone, but will have lived a noble life that will live on in the memories of your loved ones. So he's offering three choices. There are no gods, act virtuously, you'll have a virtuous life and other people will remember you. If there are good gods, they'll reward you. If there are bad gods, well, you don't want them. We're just stuck with that. The article, which is referenced at the bottom here, you don't need to write the whole thing down. Just look for Stoicism in a time of pandemic. It's an interesting use of Marcus Aurelius to talk about our situation today. So I'm going to claim that there's something missing in both the Stoics and the Epicureans here. On the Stoic side, let's call it joy. Let's call it the kind of pleasure that comes from relaxing in the garden, of being open to something, rather than thinking about it just virtuous, think of it as fun. You don't get much of that in Stoicism. It's a very serious philosophy. We need to lighten up a bit. On the Epicurean side, what seems to be missing is duty, the very thing the Stoics argue, that there may be things which will bring you out of the garden, things you ought to do. what's missing in both of them is that sense of intervention, the sense that this is a random thing and it's really tough on me, this is my role in the play. What's missing is, damn it, this role is a bad role. There's no sense of individual or social agency and change, trying to work for justice. If it's just fate or luck, oh well, but maybe you should resist. If it's Providence, it seems to be a lousy Providence, it's producing bad play, why should I want to act in this play? In other words, there's a certain willingness to not just accept, but to try to intervene, to change, maybe pointlessly, whether you believe it's, you could say, well, your role is to be the Roman emperor, my role is to be the revolutionary. That's okay, I'll play my role. They didn't have a slot for that, but one could create one. Or you could say, there's no roles, it's just random events. Well, let's make it better. There's too much acceptance on both sides. But what does it mean if you take away and you say, there's too much acceptance here? How do we move beyond that? How do we get to the point where we have to think about intervening? So what I've been saying, to summarize this point, then we'll stop for questions and then we can go on if we have time into the poetry. I'm saying the Stoics and Epicureans, despite their extremely different views about the nature of the world, have a very similar view about how to handle this illness. It's not the kind of illness they knew how to deal with. By the way, it's not a new illness. You can trace back Parkinson's symptoms, or what appear to be Parkinson's symptoms, pretty far. It's a problem, as you know, trying to figure out what the illnesses that ancients describe are, because their descriptions of the symptoms are never very clear from our point of view. But in any case, the illness was around, but it doesn't fit the usual model of illness that they offer. But their suggestion about how to deal with it is basically resignation, acceptance, and dealing. Now, I'm saying, no, let's be creative, let's have intervention, let's say the roles are too fixed. Whether those are providential or random, let's try to make them better. Now, what that involves is some kind of new kind of perception, search for the virtuous act, the appropriate way to live, but not in the rational Stoic world, but in a random world, atoms bouncing around. It's not total chaos. We have complicated evolution, social structures, and so on. But it's a world where we can't control what happens. It's a world where, true to the feeling of both philosophies, we're confronted with things which try to shake us. But we're looking for something like what the Stoics wanted: virtues, excellent action that is according to our nature. On the other hand, in a world that is not prefigured with a beautiful set of nature, no fixed role. That's scary. We're stuck out beyond the standard categories, roles, and we have to live out in that space. Then we paused for some questions. And then we came back to the problem of the present moment. I wanted to suggest that if we're going to live out beyond any simple structure, there's a question of who we are and what we're facing. And I made a reference to an old religious theme from my childhood, where people said, God wants you to rely only on him. Therefore, If you're proud of something you're relying on, your ability to dance, your ability to give lectures, your ability to talk, he will take that away so that you have to rely purely on him, stripping away your old self. I found this repellent, this idea. This God's a nasty father. You will obey me, I will take away anything you try to be independent of. But then when I thought further about it, I thought to myself, the people who said that the most were certain mystics, St. John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila. And in fact, what they were saying, what they did, was not say, oh, God has taken everything away from me, oh shit. They said, God has put me in a situation where my standard roles and responses have been stripped away. And I have to find what he wants in a world which is no longer structured by the usual categories. I have to become sensitive to what God is calling me to. And that's in fact what these people did. Teresa and John were reformers. They got together to reform the religious orders they were part of, got into a great deal of trouble with the authorities. They were imprisoned, pushed around, complicated lives. Teresa said at one point, I told God, if this is the way you treat your friends, no surprise you have so few. So I thought to myself, maybe I shouldn't resist that narrative of God stripping things away. And I should think of it in a new light. What it says is, leave God aside. PD or random events have stripped away my usual abilities and my usual roles. And I'm facing a new world, and I have to learn to live with it and in it. So there's two issues. What are we facing? And who are we? How do we do that? What we're facing is the present moment, and who we are is the issue of narrative identity. And that's what we're going to talk about. Present moment, that's what we're facing. Narrative identity, that's how we face it. And then how do we live with that? That's the last point. Well, if we're going to be out beyond the current boxes and roles and references, we're going to have to seize the day in the present moment. And that brings up another poem by Horace. There's two translations of it there, and the Latin is on the side. The word carpe diem is in the last line. Seize the day. The word carpe in Latin means something like harvest the day. It's not steal it, but harvest the fruit of the day. It's worth noting that the poem itself is a seduction poem. It's addressed to a woman, Luconoi, whom he's trying to get to go to bed with him. He's saying basically, drink your wine, live it up. Time is flying. It's like those poems by John Donne or people in the metaphysical poets who say, time is flying, boy, come to bed, baby. The poem says, we can't know when we're going to die, and don't waste your time doing astrology, Babylonian number. Better to just live what you got, cut down your hopes, water your wine, which meant the Greeks and Romans stored wine in a kind of thick form, almost like honey. So when you wanted to drink, you had to water it a bit. And how much you watered it determined how alcoholic it was. So water your wine, make it drinkable, drink it up. The envious present moment is flying past. Seize the day, come to bed, baby. Now the poem is, in fact, a seduction poem, but it's, of course, saying much more than that. Here's a point, by the way, just a little scholarship. Horace, you see him there with the double line, lived from 65 BC to 8 AD, almost identical with the Emperor Augustus, and very close to Virgil, the famous poet who died earlier, but was about the same age. Whereas Catullus, the other great Latin lyric poet, was younger, older rather. He died when Horace was only about 10. And Lucretius, the great Roman epic poet who wrote the Epicurean, The Nature of Things, had been dead for 10 years when Horace was born. On the other hand, if you go over into the AD period, Seneca, the writer we saw the last time, a Stoic writer, was born in 4 BC. So when he was alive as a teenager when Horace died, and Seneca lived through the time of Nero and died in 65. But Marcus Aurelius, down at the bottom on the right, he starts out, he was born in 121, and he was emperor from about 160. So it's quite a time gap between Seneca and Horace, people like that, and Marcus Aurelius. Well, carpe diem, seize the day, live for the present moment. Here's a quote: live for the sensation of life, not for the story you tell about your life. Now, that quote is from the other reference that I mentioned, John Gray, the philosopher in England, and it's talking about cats as opposed to dogs. He's suggesting that we need to learn from the feline, who don't really need us, but deign to deal with us, and who have this ability to simply relax into whatever they're doing at the present moment. They never seem to be anxious. They're not telling themselves a story, they just enjoy the current sensation. That's a lovely idea, and I want to criticize it. I want to say that it's not as simple as that. When we talk about the present moment, we're talking about, let's stop and smell the roses. Well, let's think about that. There's some roses, and there's some roses in the Eugene Rose Garden. Smell the roses. There's a commercial, which I've been running into when I look at YouTube lately. They keep presenting it to me, for Woodford Reserve bourbon, saying Woodford Reserve bourbon has 50 different notes that you can take. In other words, they're trying to take the stuff from the wine business where people say, oh, this wine has notes of chocolate, blueberry, old leather, tobacco, and so on. They're saying, this bourbon has notes of squash, rose, whatever. In other words, they're trying to get you to taste it in a more complicated way, which is to say the taste is more complicated. The present moment is not simply, oh, bourbon, or oh, green, or oh, rose. Internal to those sensations is complicated internal structure, references, differentiation. Even the rose garden, there's different kinds of roses. You walk from one to the other, they smell differently. I can't really say because Parkinson takes away your sense of smell. But I remember in the old days walking and feeling how different it was to walk amid the roses. Here's a picture. I simply did a Google search for the present moment and then said, show me images. And this is what it showed. What struck me was how many of these images have horizon lines. Look at them. Here's the single line. Bring yourself back to the present moment. What's the phenomenology? What's the appearance of the present moment? Here's a couple. And look at those pictures. The first is a picture of mountains. Then there's a picture taken from one of Caspar David Friedrich's paintings, German romantic painting. Then there's a view of a city. What I point out to you is this is what's supposed to present the present moment as a complete thing you can rest in. But what it presents is spatially complex, harmonious, certainly, that's what they want, making the picture beautiful. But there's a horizon, there's a near and far, left and right, multiple things, buildings here and there, clouds here and there. There's internal complexity in the present moment. So it's not just a blank stare. Even that quiet stare is synthesizing a multiplicity into an experience. Now it's true with a drug or meditation or other techniques, you can stop that synthetic action. You can concentrate only on the green or the smell of the rose or one of the 50 notes in the bourbon or what have you. You can do that. But that's done by an effort. The concrete, ordinary present moment is complex, both spatially and temporally. It extends from the present to the past. To talk about it as a present moment is to talk about it as being in a series, and that series has its own temporal unity. If you look in the lower left there, there's a picture of a hand opening a doorknob. Think about that. In the present moment, there's a tool there. I could concentrate merely on the play of light on the metal of the doorknob. It's beautiful. I could concentrate on the design. But one of the things involving the experience is it's a doorknob. It's a doorknob, and you know what to do with it. You turn it, and you open the door. There's a practice there. There's a social pattern. There are possibilities. There are things that you can do with that. There's a door you can go through, activities you can perform outside. Or in the picture of the city, complicated social grammar telling you what the different parts of the city are for. So what's presented to you in the present has meaningful references beyond the present moment to unpresent possibilities, which give the present moment its meaning. Now, as I've said, you can, with drugs or certain kinds of meditation and other techniques, strip away that veneer of meaning which unifies that, making a kind of pure experience of green or rose or what have you. And that's very, very powerful. But it is a carefully engineered abstraction. And when we tell you to concentrate on the present moment, it's not to do that. You may do that for various reasons, but it's not what's important. What's important is to settle into what is present for you and what it calls you to do and what it pulls you back from being scattered and busy. So what we've been looking at is the present moment, the idea that it's got internal complexity and that it offers more than just simple green, right? But the question is about identity. They'll come together. Who are you when you're out there beyond the role, beyond the accepted modes of doing things? You can't just define yourself by what everybody says. Who are you? I argue that there are two errors we have to avoid. They're polar. One is that there's a fixed, solid atomic self. This is what you are. You have these qualities, A, B, C, D. And the other is that you're an infinitely flexible creator. Now there are two poles. The one is your self is like a thing, like a rock. Rock has a certain weight, you have a certain character. The rock has a certain texture, you have certain habits and certain preferences, like the rock has layers, and they're just there, fixed. It's atomic in the sense it can't be divided, and it's reliable, and you can rely on it. This is an image of the self that you get, say, in economics, where people are taken to have a set of preferences. And your preferences are what define you, at least for the purposes of economic study. Or when you say, I don't know who I am, but I can rely on the fact that I'm Italian, or that I'm my mother's son, or that I'm Catholic, or whatever. There's certain fixed things that you take, of course you take them as fixed. Now the other extreme is the notion of the infinitely flexible self. There's an interesting issue here, and it's a theological issue, surprisingly. If you look at the religions of the world, usually the God figures, the creators in the various religions, work with material that's already there. If you look at Genesis, the book of Genesis is, of course, a layered thing. There's different texts been brought together. But the earliest layers in it have the Spirit of God moving over the waters. The waters are already there, chaotic. The Spirit of God brings order to them. And that's the usual routine in most religions, that the powerful God is facing some kind of disorderly stuff, which it brings order to. But that's not true in some of the developments in the Abrahamic religions, in Judaism, in Christianity, and Islam. There you get the idea that God is the creator out of nothing. He's not faced with anything. He just goes, poof, and the world appears. That's not typical in most of the theologies in the world. But that's because there's no infinite God. But if you believe that there's an infinite God, it can do absolutely anything. It creates a whole lot of theological and philosophical problems. You can imagine what they might be. Unrestricted, self-creating. But that's not a very realistic thing, because we aren't exactly that. But what happened, there's a whole history of ideas that you could trace through some stuff in Platonism, through some Middle Ages, through, surprisingly enough, a lot of stuff that happened in Muslim theology in the 11 and 1200s, where you get the idea that God has no patterns to follow. If you look at Aquinas or somebody like that, God has patterns to follow that are built into his nature, basically the old Platonic forms. And he follows those because they're good. Whereas the other view, the view that's coming out of the Muslims and picked up by another Christian group, is that God has no patterns at all. When Descartes says God could have made a world where 2 + 2 = 5, he's saying that there are no forms or rules that God did not create. And he could have changed the world to make it whatever he wanted. Whereas a Platonist would say, no, those rules are logic, they're in the nature of things. Well, that's a whole theological and philosophical, metaphysical dispute. It's very interesting. But my point is, it's dangerous if you take that notion of a self that's so free and secularize it down to yourself, which is what you get in some versions of existentialism, in some versions of libertarianism. You get a self which has no context and which is going to do whatever it damn well wants. Those are extreme. The one, the self is totally fixed, the other is totally free. We're not in that position. I don't know whether you think that those are fantasies. I'm totally fixed, I'm totally free. Or is it an ideal? You try to be one or the other? Or is it a temptation to make yourself one or the other? Do you want to be Ayn Rand on the one hand, right? Or Saint so-and-so on the other? Is it a hope? Is it an illusion? You can play around with those two poles, but neither of them are really suitable. Because instead, we have to think of ourselves as being a self in process, always within spaces and possibilities, not empty spaces, always in between. That's a quote from Plato. We're always metaxou, we're always in the middle. If you look up narrative identity, you'll get this is just, again, I just did a search in Google and brought up web pages. Those are what you see. There's a whole long literature, psychological literature, about how we tell ourselves our identity. We make up stories which create our identity. And obviously what I'm getting at here is something to do with new stories. Let's think about it. I'm taking some ideas here from Paul Ricoeur, my old friend. Ricoeur goes back to Aristotle and he says, think about what Aristotle says about plot. Aristotle's talking about Greek drama, so I have a Greek drama up there. Oedipus doesn't realize that the guy he killed on the road, the wife he married, and so on, are part of a story. And he's forced eventually in the play to realize that they are twined together in a story of his life. So discordant events are brought together, made concordant by being twisted into a plot. Right? So Ricoeur suggests that when we create a story of our lives, what we're doing is taking scattered events and linking them. This led to that. This is the cause of that. These two things are related to that, to produce a comedy or a tragedy or what have you. So you have some images here of Hamlet, or Jane Austen, or Saturday Night Live, or a Japanese no play. These are all examples where the plot creates a unity over time of events which could be seen differently. It weaves them together into a story. And of course, it could be rival story. And Ricoeur suggests there's two senses of identity here. There's the identity of what, and what are you? I'm a human being. I have this body. It's like a thing. And there's the identity of who, which is like, who I have these values. I made these promises. And those are quite different. The same body could be a different who if you had a big religious conversion, or you turned your life around in some way, or you were brainwashed or something like that. The who may be different than the what. You can be in different senses, legally the same person, but your friends will say, you're just not the same person anymore, David. Of course, that can come in degrees. It doesn't have to be one way or the other. My point is that if you think about identity not as who do we identify in the crowd and call cold, but rather, what kind of person? Who is this? That's an identity which has a narrative component, a component that weaves things together. And we do that actively. We don't do it individually, we do it also together. The stories are forced on us, we alter them. But that weaving, that making a plot, bringing things together, that creates a sense of self as who. I thought it would be interesting at this point, talking about who, to bring into the moment the two David Colbs, because there are two of us. There's me, I'm in the lower there, one. I'm number one because I'm older, 8 months older. And the other one is above, number two, is also David A. Kolb. We're both David A. Kolb. In fact, we're both David Allen Kolb. We're both born in 1939. I'm in April, he's in December. He's much more famous. He has 105,000 references to his works. I'm much less famous. I have only about 1,200 references to mine. He's made a lot of money in his learning theory and selling services to business. He's taught in business school. I've talked with him. We've never met. But we kept getting emails for one another. I even had a phone call once from somebody in South Africa saying, Mr. Kolb, can I reprint this article of yours? I was very tempted to give him permission to do so, but I said, I'm sorry, I'm not the David Kolb you have in mind. At that time, I was more on the web than he was. Now he's much more. He's retired, he lives in Hawaii. We've talked. He says it's like a ghost talking with me. My wife has used his psychological work in her work, and he took my book on Hegel and Heidegger and put it on his tabletop and as a cocktail party thing, because people would look at it and say, my God, did you write that? The answer, no, he didn't. So we have a lot of fun about that. We spell the name Allen differently, but it's the same person, same name. Both from the Midwest, for that matter, too. So David Kolb's learning theory is very famous. It has to do with 4 kinds of learning and a certain way of you. It's basically John Dewey, basically. You have a concrete experience, you reflect on it, you make a theory, you try it out, and you go cycle again and again. You could say it's scientific method, you could say it's just common sense. And from that, you get personality types and so on. The point is, it's a process. The identity is formed by this constant redoing of the story. Right? So I honor the guy. It's funny, I used to get emails for him probably 10 times a month. Now that he's retired, I don't so much, but we occasionally communicate. Well, I want to have a model that will help here. France. France, you say, what's that about? Well, look, what does it mean to say you're French? After all, the geographical area of France has changed. There's some maps there that show it at different times. The population of France has changed from time to time. There are different groups, and originally were independent kingdoms, little principalities who didn't get along with one another. Burgundy, Savoie, Languedoc, Brittany, and so on. These were separate things which got gradually meshed into the French identity, a very strong national identity, which took centuries to do. It took a strong central government. It took the creation of the central language. It took building a sense of shared history, which didn't necessarily be there in the beginning. It took the common experience of the French Revolution and things like that. There's a long, careful building up of the French identity. So you have multiple people doing many things, going in different directions, gradually being coalesced into the identity of this nation. And that process took weaving. It took bringing together different ideas, different people, harmonizing things that were not harmonized together at all originally. Well, that's the process of building a self. Now, in this case, it's a nation. But think about it. You, not France and people, but you, multiple feelings, multiple responses, multiple habits, going in all different directions, gradually being brought together into a unified self, the way they brought all those people together into a French identity. It took time. This is what Nietzsche says we do. We have multiple wills to power, multiple feelings, multiple drives going this way, that way, and the other way, and we gradually aesthetically bring a self out of it. Nietzsche compares it to building a garden out of a messy bit of nature. You suppress some things, you exalt other things. Right? There's a process. It's not just given. It's not like, oh, I'm just there. But neither is it like I just created out of nothing. You pull the self together out of these multiple strands, just as the people made France out of multiple peoples and regional groups, and natives, dialects, and things like that. So there's a process of creating France, there's a process of creating you, and it's a narrative process. How do we live on the frontier, out beyond the standard roles? How do we create a new story? How do we find new things to do? How do we see in the present moment possibilities which we hadn't noticed before? Here's an interesting quote. This is from William James. I don't completely agree with it, but it's an interesting quote. Take any demand, however slight, which any creature, however weak, may make. Ought it not for its own soul's sake to be satisfied? If not, prove why not. The only possible kind of proof you could deduce would be the exhibition of another creature who should make a demand that ran the other way. I'm not sure that's true, but what I want to say is, here's an interesting case. What is in the present moment is, among other things, demands. There's people suffering. There's the ant you're about to step on. There's the homeless person on the side of the street. There's 4 million people suffering climate problems in Bangladesh, and so on. You're surrounded by demands. Whether you choose to notice them or not, they're there. Now, this raises, of course, an issue which takes us into Buddhism. Now, what's interesting about Buddhism is that they have the no self doctrine. There's no self. But what they don't have is a fixed, substantial, enduring self. What they do have is context and linkage. There's maybe no self, but there's a network. There's a lovely Sanskrit word, pratitya sumatpada, which I've written there, just to see the Sanskrit. It's usually translated dependent origination, the idea that things arise in connection with other things. So they haven't given up causality. It's their version of the law of karma. Things arise and cause other things to arise. It doesn't mean there's something continuous, but it does mean that there's an influence from the past into the present. And then the suggestion is once you realize that, you should be in a position where you can have compassion for all those demands and suffering that are surrounding us. And that's the second step. Right? But keep that idea that the Buddhist no self doctrine doesn't mean you're out in the void, because the self is in a context, linkage, causality, history. Right? So what do we have? Activist Buddhists, Stoic reformers, Epicurean revolutionaries, is that what we're talking about? You know, yes, that's what I'm suggesting. We need that. I want to pursue a theme from Buddhism. The Bodhisattva vows. These are the standard Bodhisattva vows. Bodhisattva is, in Buddhism, a person who is ready to become a Buddha, go into nirvana, but refuses to do so, and stays in the world to help people. And the standard Buddhist Bodhisattva vows are these, different wordings. Suffering beings are numerous, I vow to liberate them all. Attachment is inexhaustible, I vow to release it all. The gates to truth are numberless, I vow to master them all. The way of awakening is supreme, I vow to realize it. And then you say, well, wait a minute, you're going to vow to liberate all beings. Of course, there are all sorts of stories about bodhisattvas who remain sort of hanging in the world as sort of powerful angel-like beings, saving people endlessly. But hey, I'm just a kid, I can't do that. And Robert Aitken said, people say, why even recite those vows? You can't fulfill them. And he says, well, Kanon, the goddess of mercy and compassion, weeps because she can't, but that doesn't mean we don't try to do it. I want to pause and look at Kanon for a minute. Japanese, that's Kanon, Kanzeon, Guanyin in Chinese. This is a very interesting figure from Hindu and Buddhist mythology, usually pictured the way you see there, either sort of quietly sitting or she's standing with many arms. Now, originally, it's Avalokiteshvara is the Sanskrit name, the Lord who looks down from above. One of the interesting things about this god is it's a trans god, used to be a male. In India, it's a man. By the time it gets to China, it's for the most part a woman. But it's a god or goddess, as you choose, of compassion, of concern. And if you look at that quote there, the original Sanskrit of the name, which is slightly different, is the one who hears the voices of the suffering. So you always see this god pictured as looking down and being a little bit sad. And you also picture them, here's some pictures from mostly Japan. There's a lot in Japan, you'll find these big tall statues, 50 meters high, probably taken off a bit from big Buddhas, but also probably from Christian Virgin Mary type stuff. But usually the god is pictured with, or the goddess is pictured with many, many arms. Why many, many arms? Because each arm has got a helpful thing to give to people. This god is trying to help everybody. So you have to have 1,000 arms to help out people. Or, as in the pictures on the left-hand side, that's from Sanjusan Gendo in Kyoto, there are 1,000 images of Kanon. And they're life-size. And you walk by them, it's a huge building. And there's 1,000 of them. They're all slightly different, wooden statues, life-size. And it's an attempt to symbolize the infinity of compassion, the amount of need in the world and the amount of compassion that tries to meet it, because each statue has many arms. Right? So I'm using this as an example of one possible response if you're out beyond the standard boxes and you realize that you're surrounded by need, suffering, right? And if you need a story, well, one story is possibly the Bodhisattva story to try and respond and answer to that suffering. But the suffering is overwhelming. I vow to save them all. How do you do that? We don't have 1,000 arms. So you have to pick and choose. And that, of course, is a matter of weaving a story, making priorities. Are you completely unable to move because the ants walking on the street in front of you keep you from taking a step? Are you unable to help the person by the side of the road who's homeless because you're thinking about the 4 million people in Bangladesh who need their money even more than this guy does? I mean, you have to make choices. And in doing so, you're weaving a story. And of course, you could also have a story that has you prescinding, hey, I'm not going to answer these problems. I'm just going to be myself. But I'm saying the no self doctrine probably leads you to responding with compassion because you don't have a fixed self that has to be kept that way. So the first point I'm making is it's interesting to refer to the Buddhist no self doctrine because it's not a doctrine of the self floating nowhere. Buddhist no self doctrine is no self, but in a network of causes and effects, in a past to the future. And if that's so, you have to tell a story which weaves that together somehow. You may weave it together by saying, I've had a conversion, I'm breaking, but still that's a story. And when you have that, you become sensitive to the people, and even down to the ants in the street, who are surrounding you. And one possible solution is the 1,000-armed Kanon. But how do you do that? How do you live on that frontier? Being open and alert. Well, that's nice. What does that mean? And there are dangers here. Because remember what I said about narrative identity. You take events which are not necessarily connected, obviously, and you connect them by making a plot. Well, that's what conspiratorial thinking does. We talk about conspiratorial thinking. People say, had you noticed that the CIA did this? Oh, it doesn't have any evidence. But that doesn't have any evidence. That shows they really did it. Or, look, there's this thing that happened in the network, and there's this thing over here, there's that thing over there. You think they're not connected. We think they are. That's creating a plot. That's exactly the thing Ricoeur was talking about. So to create a conspiratorial interpretation of things, it says, what you saw in the New York Times, what the French did the other day, and the Russians over here, and the refusal of people to do that, that's all one thing. It's all the CIA or all the QAnon or it's all whatever. That's the same thing we do to create narrative identity. It's just sort of gone wild. So there's no, it's not like that's a different kind of thing than what you do to create a normal identity. It's just somehow out of balance. It's too sensitive. There's no rules for that. We're back to the problem of practical wisdom. And this refers again to something I mentioned before from Aristotle. Practical wisdom is not what he calls speculative or theoretical wisdom. When you're doing speculative or theoretical wisdom, you're looking for facts about the way things are. Practical wisdom is facts about what you should do. And the problem is to make a decision about what you should do, there's always an infinite number of reflections. Well, here's what you should do. But what about this? What about this possible consequence? What about its effect over here? Have you really weighed it against this other alternative? Once you get into that, you can get paralyzed. Right? Well, being the practically wise person is the one who says, you know enough, make a decision. Those are the relevant items, the rest are not relevant. Right? So that's the kind of person Aristotle says you need to find. Someone who can advise you about what's really the relevant issues and why what you're trying to think about now is just overthinking. Right? And there's no rules for that because what you're asking is how to apply a rule, and there's no rules for how to apply rules, or you get into an infinite regress. At some point, there has to be a judgment. And that judgment is going to be made by people who look at the circumstance, perceive it rightly, or at least as well as they can. And that, says Aristotle, is not a theoretical matter. It's a habit. It's a skill. Some people have more of it than others. It's never pure. Well, that's the way it is with narrative identity, too. There's no rule that says, hey, you've gone too far, you're joining a QAnon, or you haven't gone far enough, the story you're telling about yourself is too skimpy. You have to weave, just as when trying to develop a French identity, they can go too far, they can go too small. Right? It's always a matter of balance. Again, we refer to the reference that was made to process theology. The gods in process theology don't have total control of things. They have to weave what's around in the world. And that's more accurate than the sort of pure creator God. You have to put together stuff that's already lying around. Now, how do you do that? You see the little picture on the far side there on the left. That refers to a Buddhist Jataka story. The Jataka stories, Jataka, are stories about the lives of the Buddha before he became the Buddha. You know, in the general theory, you get reborn. As you get reborn, you get better and better. And the guy who eventually becomes Gautama the Buddha had many, many lives where he was getting better and better and better. So as a way of talking about moral teaching, they have these stories about, like lives of the saints, about how the Buddha, the future Buddha, did good things, and we should follow the rule. And that particular picture there refers to a Jataka story that goes like this. There are two future Buddhas walking along, Amida and Gautama. That's not their names at this time, but that's what they're going to be. Gautama, the Buddha we know, and Amida, the future Buddha that comes later, not now. And they come across a tiger, a tiger mother who's starving to death and has her little tiger cubs are also dying. And they say, it's compassion. We have to do something about this. And Amida says, okay, I'll go into the village down the road. I'll buy some meat and bring it back so we can feed the tiger so that the cubs will live. So he goes off and does that. He comes back and discovers that while he was gone, the future Buddha has fed himself to the tiger and solved the problem by giving himself to the tiger for meat. Now, of course, because you believe in reincarnation, you can do that. But the point is, he broke the rules. He thought outside the box. You don't just go and buy food for the tiger, you just give yourself. Now, that depends upon a whole metaphysical theory that you might not accept. But the point is, the reaction was a reaction which did not follow the standard rules. And that's the kind of alertness you might need to have in trying to understand circumstances, especially for ourselves nowadays, where we're dealing with climate change, we're dealing with social change, when the old rules don't work, we have to invent new things. It's very scary. And you're guided by compassion, but without any fixed rules to know exactly how to do it. That's tough. And we have to do it together to weave a new identity. That's even tougher. But that's unfortunately where we are. I'd like to finish this discussion with a few summary remarks. I began with some autobiographical detail about what it's like to suffer from Parkinson's disease. I wasn't trying to look for pity, but rather show the problem of integrating the loss and degeneration the disease brings into one's life. How does one narrate loss? I looked at what Stoicism and its friendly rival Epicureanism might have to say, and found some ways in which they helped quite a bit, and other ways in which they didn't. I tried to find some way to take the best of both, looking for the virtues, the ways of acting excellently in the Stoic sense, but in a world that's more random, more Epicurean. This led me to talk about living in the present moment and how that cliche has depth that isn't always obvious. And I spoke about the ways in which we narrate and create our identities. And I spoke about some ways of narrating ourselves that might help widen the life that PD narrows. Can we find a virtuous and noble way of living according to nature, where nature is not as rationally organized as with the Stoics, nor as totally random as with the Epicureans, where we've been pushed beyond our standard accepted abilities and roles? Parkinson's and chronic disease bring a paradox. The same thing which takes away our ability to respond widens our possibilities for imagining responses. Because you know you're going to die. You've been pushed out of your standard boxes, your old do's and don'ts. And yet you have less power to take advantage of that freedom. I said this isn't looking for pity. And yet when I looked into how we can narrate ourselves better in a narrowing world, I ended up talking about compassion. But pity and compassion are not the same. Pity has the feel that I'm above you or below, and you're below. I can walk and dance. You, I can pity because you can't do that. Maybe I help you. That's okay. Maybe even generous. But there's a move there from rich to poor, from strong to weak. Compassion is different. It's directionless, comes from all directions. The compassionate person sees we're all in it together. We're all on the same level. The same compassion I extend toward you, I extend to myself because I understand our mutual vulnerability. Now, I've been talking about Parkinson's disease and neurological disorders, but as I'm sure you've realized, my subject here is not really Parkinson's disease. It's true, Parkinson's accelerates and intensifies the deterioration that we all face as we age. And some of us, yes, will die suddenly in the midst of a busy life, an auto accident or sudden heart attack or whatever. But for most of us, there will be degeneration. Not perhaps for as long, maybe not thrown in your face every morning, but it will be there, in your face, soon enough. What we can learn from the old philosophers then applies to us all. We're all heading down that same hill. We need to link arms together in compassion as we travel down, being open and sensitive to what we can still do for ourselves, for one another, and for the world. I'd like to thank you for attending this talk on Parkinson's disease, Stoicism, and the problems of narrating a life of loss. If you're interested in the lecture source, the essay, A Shaky Walk Downhill, you can find a reference to it on my website, dkolb.org, or you can buy it at Amazon. If you're more interested in pursuing Stoicism, since you're already looking at YouTube, search on YouTube and you'll find a whole menu full of videos and people, two of whom I would recommend. One, a gentleman named Massimo Pigliucci, who has some very good videos on Stoicism, and another one, Greg Sadler, who has good videos on Stoicism and many other things in philosophy. I think these are important topics. I'm glad we could share them, and I wish you all the best.